Welcome, everybody. So sorry for that very abrupt ending, but here we go. We're in session 2. Want to get started on time. It is 4 o'clock. So I just want to start by apologizing because it appears my last email, the link wasn't present. So we're probably going to see people drift in because I did send the link moments ago to many. So we're at about 59 of us, I think, in the room. Oh, 63 of us in the Zoom room right now. So welcome to everybody. So welcome. I want to welcome the new attendees who weren't with us last time, as well as those who are kind of back with us. And thank you for joining us. It's another beautiful fall day here in Evanston. And we're just grateful that you chose to be here with us today. I do want to apologize again for those who couldn't enter to the last session. We had set up the link in a incorrect way, and so it limited people from being able to come in. And so I really want to apologize for that. I guess a few of us here are just not techie. It's what we get for having a 60-year-old lead a meeting, right? So, but I'm in. We're good. So we'll move ahead. We have, again, over 200 registrants, and we don't know how many are going to join us today, but we'll hope for as many as we can get. And I would like you to take a moment just to greet each other. Use the chat and say your name and the community that you're a part of, your faith community or other affiliation that you want to share, while I go ahead and introduce the session so you kind of know who's here with you. And hopefully you can see pictures as well of people, so you can see some of the people you know as well. So just this session 2 is titled "How Did We Get Here?" And we're just going to talk about a few logistics at the beginning here. As you recall, they're 90-minute long sessions, and they are being recorded. So if you do not want to be recorded, you are going to have to keep your camera off and keep your microphone off. Second, again, there's no scheduled breaks. So please, stand and stretch and do what you need to do. Take a break if you need it. Just take care of yourself. Then there will be time for questions with our featured speakers. And those will be prompted that we would ask you to enter information into the chat when that is appropriate for you to do so. And please, after you're kind of doing your greetings, we'd ask you not to use the chat for other reasons, so that when we do have questions for the speakers, they're coming in and we can get to them easily. So finally, also a reminder to everybody, we did introduce at the last session our conversation agreements. And Adam, I'm going to ask if you can put that slide up again for us to be able to look at those. And we want you to keep these in mind, certainly as we go through today's session, certainly as you're interacting with people on the chat or in any other ways. So this is the communication agreement slide, again, that we want to listen to one another's thoughts and opinions with respect. Listen to understand, not for agreement or disagreement. Resist interrupting one another and waiting for people to finish their thought. Stepping up and stepping back. So being willing to share a thought or your ideas, but then also making sure there's room for others to do the same, opportunities for others to do the same. Outside of the workshop, not to share any information or stories that identify individuals or individual churches that are participating or religious communities that are participating in this conversation. And then in this difficult conversation, because it can be a difficult conversation, to accept and expect discomfort and to try to learn from it. So those are agreements. And again, we just ask that you honor those agreements in any interactions for today. Okay, Adam, you can take that screen off at this point and we can get started. So this session focuses on why reparations are appropriate in Evanston. What's the harm that was done? How did it happen? And we're going to explore how housing discrimination, among other discriminations, led to wealth inequities between Black and white residents, and also inequities which do continue to exist today. And we're going to start this session with a presentation by Morris Robinson. He's better known as Dino to the Evanston community. So Dino is the founder and director of Shorefront Legacy Center, an organization that he pioneered in 1995. And Shorefront's mission is to collect, preserve, and educate people about the Black history on Chicago's suburban North Shore. Its archives include documents and artifacts that are an invaluable record of the lived experience of Black people in this area. Dino's also played an integral role in the development of reparations programs in Evanston. Along with Jenny Thompson of the Evanston History Center, Dino authored Evanston's Policies and Practices Directly Affecting the African American Community from 1900 to 1960. And this document provides the evidentiary base for defending the legality of Evanston's reparations program in the inevitable lawsuits attacking it, and was one of the choices for your pre-work today. If you haven't yet read this piece, we encourage you to take the time to do so. And you can find a link on our website, the resources tab, and under the Evanston History and Reparations category. It's in our top recommendations. Dino's also a member of the Reparations Stakeholder Authority that will oversee the distribution of funds from the Evanston Community Foundation Reparations Fund. You will learn more about that fund. It's a different fund than the city fund. There are two reparation funds. You'll learn more about that fund in our third session on October 3rd. Just a reminder that Dino will take questions after his presentation. So this is the time where, as from now going forward, as Dino presents, you can type questions in the chat. Welcome, Dino, and thank you for joining us. Great to see you again.
Thank you for having me today, and thank you all for attending. I see there's about 83 people attending this session. Again, thank you for having me this afternoon, and I'm going to do a share screen momentarily on a presentation that I will share with everyone that highlights specific aspects of the growth of the African American community and the effects of segregated practices, racism, and all the other isms that are tied to a targeted community in Evanston. And as much as we like to view Evanston as a base station for diversity, it looks good on paper, but in reality, these issues in the past that have we learn about in history that has affected throughout this country also happened here in Evanston, Illinois. So give me a moment, I want to share my screen and get started. And play. Great, can everybody see what's on the screen? Beautiful, thank you so much. I can't see the chat right now, so unfortunately, if you put something in the text, I'll make sure I read that after the presentation. But I think it's very important to really frame what we're looking at and the effect of what laws affect the African American community. And I want to start with just the state of Illinois itself. In 1813, Illinois Territory prohibited free Blacks to migrate into the area, into the state. And in fact, free Blacks were given 15 days to leave. Otherwise, they will receive 39 lashes to the back. Illinois then adopted the Indiana Black Codes, which is basically a legalized servitude, indentured servitude to white families. So a free Black could not be brought into the state of Illinois, but an indentured Black could be, as long as they worked for a family. It was interesting with this codes, and I'm going to read a paragraph here of some of the policies that were surrounding that limited the mobility of Blacks in the state of Illinois. To employ an uncertified Negro was to incur a fine of $1.50 for each day he labored. To harbor a slave or servant or hinder his recapture was a felony, punishable by a fine of twice the value of the man and 30 stripes on the bare back. To sell to or buy of or trade with a slave or servant without consent of the master was absolutely forbidden. If a slave was found 10 miles from home without a permit, he was liable to arrest and flogging. Should he appear at any house or farm without written permission from his master, the owner of the place to which he came might give him 10 lashes well laid on. Should he commit any offense to which a white man would be fined, he was to be whipped at a rate of 20 lashes for every $8 of fine. These were the black codes in the state of Illinois that stayed in existence through the Civil War. So with that bookmark, with that base station of Black life in the state of Illinois, that laid the foundation for how a particular group of people were treated throughout history, and it matriculated through all the communities. And it's not unusual to understand too that at one point in Illinois' history, after 1900, there were recorded 1,000 sundown towns in the state of Illinois. And a sundown town is a policy, sometimes written or unwritten, where Blacks were barred from living or visiting that community. To this day, we have about 200 sundown towns. They're not legal, but when you have enforcement by community members, it stays in some type of loose enforcement, which is hard to prove in a court. Let's see if we can get to the next page here. There we go. The early Black community in Evanston. The Evanston community was actually larger than what it is today. It actually expanded encompassed all of Rogers Park as well. It wasn't until later in its history, before the 1900s, that Chicago annexed the Rogers Park area, and then later in 1910 tried to annex up to Oakton Street into Evanston. But to understand how the Black population grew in Evanston, there was not necessarily a Black community, like a centralized Black community. In all of Evanston, Blacks lived everywhere. Jewish population lived everywhere. Polish, German population lived everywhere throughout Evanston. And these dots here represent pockets of Black communities throughout the city of Evanston. You'll notice some by the lakefront, immediate downtown Evanston area, North Evanston, and South Evanston. And that was great. But there was a concerted effort from 1900 on that steadily pushed the Black communities and the Black residents into one area of Evanston. And we call it now the Fifth Ward. And this was done not by very specific rules that identify Blacks who only live in one area, but they started using coding words like redevelopment or urban renewal or beautification to bring new development in areas, and they target Black communities to forcibly move them out and only allow them to live in one area. And when the area became too dense, Black families were forced to leave because there was no other housing they could find available. White residents were instructed not to rent or lease to Black residents throughout the rest of Evanston. Also, Evanston had experienced a very fast Black growth of the Black population. Its earliest residents in 1860 were numbers of 2, 43, and then by 1930, nearly 5,000. And some of this was due to a violent act that happened in Abbeville, South Carolina, with the lynching of Anthony Crawford. Anthony Crawford owned 400 acres of land in Abbeville, South Carolina. He went to the town to at the end of harvest to cash in on his crop. He was second in line. He was asked to remove himself from line and come the next day so white farmers can benefit from a better profit for their crops. He refused to leave. He was dragged out of line, taken out into court, and beaten, and then arrested. Later that night, he was dragged out of prison, tied to the back of a wagon, and dragged through town, hung, shot, burned, and buried. 30 days later, a newspaper article appeared saying that if you are related to the Crawfords and or have any affiliation with his land, you have 30 days to vacate or we cannot guarantee your safety. Thus necessitated a mass exodus from Abbeville, South Carolina, leaving behind 400 acres of land, churches, schools, homes built on that land. Anthony Crawford was building a community. The community was violently taken away from them. And these families left South Carolina with nothing and came to one of the three places they came to was Evanston, Illinois, where some family members lived. And there was a huge population boom. They were able to find work, build houses, and attain a better education, but they had to start all over again from scratch. Their net worth in Abbeville was eliminated and had to start all over again in their new homes. There's a cycle of that happened throughout the history of in the United States of Black communities that have strived to build on their own community to have it forcibly taken away from them, mostly through violent means. Some of the more famous ones are like Black Wall Street, Tulsa, Oklahoma, the Slocum Massacre, and many others. There were dozens of them all throughout the South and Midwest that happened in the United States history. But because of the fast growth of the Black community in Evanston, especially starting about 1903, a series of newspaper articles coming out talking about that, oh my gosh, there's Blacks coming to Evanston. What do we do about them? And at first you think, okay, this may be a one-off, but there were lots of these articles. There were symposiums held in community halls and in churches about the worth of the Negro population and what we can do to deal with them. There were studies that were conducted. And if you read between the lines of those studies, it was more because of they are a problem, how can we get rid of them or mitigate the growth of the Black community? And so as I say, there is many of them, and people were very vocal about what they read and what they saw. You had articles that will come out like this. This is just an excerpt of part of that article. On a block that's now known as Garnett Place between Maple and Ridge Avenue, which at this time period was predominantly white, but over a course of 10 years, fast became a predominantly African-American community. And it was originally named Ayers Place and then renamed to Garnett Place in 1939. Another article. Hat in hand group would bar Blacks, appealing to the Jim Crow element. Evanston did partake in the elements of Jim Crow without actually writing a policy on Jim Crow and putting in the law books, but adopting the lifestyle of that and the common knowledge of Blacks should know their place in their community and not to question authority. Or like this article. And this was happening all throughout the North Shore. And as I mentioned earlier about sundown towns, Kenilworth, Illinois was established as a sundown town. And when they originally advertised their location was large lots, no sidewalks, no alleys, and no Negroes. And this kind of percolated all throughout the first 20 years of Evanston newspapers. It was a common topic. The Black community did protest. It's not unusual that by 1919, there was a chapter of the NAACP here in Evanston, just like a short 6 years after the national organization was established. There was an active chapter here in Evanston. It was so new that people did not even refer to it as the NAACP. They just said a new colored civic group. And these are the players in that group that are fighting against discriminatory housing in Jim Crow elements in Evanston. It was until Edwin B. Jourdain Jr.'s arrival in Evanston, and there were many other opportunities and aspects of where Blacks tried to attain position in city government. The first gentleman trying to run for mayor in 1905, but passed away before the election took place. There were two other members of the community that tried running for alderman in 1913 and 1921. But the first successful campaign was from Edwin B. Jourdain Jr. He was a graduate of Harvard University. He's from New Bedford, Massachusetts. His father was one of the founding members of the Niagara movement, which led to the founding and establishment of the NAACP. Edwin Jourdain Jr. had a household full of civic leaders and movers and shakers. When he attended Harvard, he fought against the dean and the president of Harvard University about segregated practices in the dormitories that made national news. He fought and won in that year while he was attending Harvard University. The dormitories were desegregated. He left after graduation of Harvard. He came to Northwestern University to study journalism. with his dream to work at the Chicago Defender. He did become a managing editor of the Chicago Bee, and then later sports editor at Chicago Defender and column writer at Chicago Defender. But his path took a sharp turn when he started addressing issues of racial discriminatory practices in the school systems here in Evanston, namely how it affected his oldest daughter, Rose Jourdain, being discriminated against in Dewey School. The community members rallied around him in his effort behind that and asked him to run for alderman. He ran, he won, and he was later unseated because he was accused of voter fraud. They took him to court and found that actually he won by a larger margin, but he was still unseated. Undeterred, he ran again for the senior position, this time bringing a female counterpart to run for the junior position, thus integrating the city council with the first African-American and first female in city council in 1931. Jourdain sat in that chair for 16 years and began the battle to desegregate city policies. And he started with, all these public places. He challenged the segregated beach system. There was one beach in Evanston that was open and available to the African-American population. The other beaches were closed to that. When he started fighting that, it's interesting that the city of Evanston decided to start a beach beautification program where they targeted 4 beaches for this upgrade, but you had to buy beach tokens to go enter those beaches. Needless to say, that was a way to put a gate where African Americans would be barred from purchasing beach tokens to go to those beaches. He challenges public park usage. There was a time where, and I use this example a lot with students so they can get an idea of what Jim Crow was like. He would hold mixed baseball games, a black baseball team playing against a white baseball team. And that was unruly. So he would be denied park permits to have organized baseball games, simply for the fact that in baseball, there is physical contact. And against Jim Crow policies, a black man cannot lay hands on a white man. So he would still hold these games purposefully to showcase that you cannot have segregated policies on publicly supported parks. And he won that case. And he continued to challenge businesses, especially with movie theaters. He held a deciding vote on whether movie theaters were petitioning to show movies on Sundays. He said, well, you can have movies on Sundays, but you have to desegregate your seating. And the movie theaters promised to do that. They did not uphold their promise. And throughout the several years after that, he had to continue to find and challenge the movie theaters to desegregate its seating. The African-American community as well fought back against that and launched lawsuits against these movie theaters. He also challenged segregated school systems, housing, and the general environment, which the Black community engaged in. And it wasn't met with opposition. People were bold. He's gotten personal letters addressed, signed, and the locational person of people who are against his policies that he was trying to do. And in this particular letter, which in the end is where it states, what are you trying to do? Start a war between coloreds and whites? You should know your place and you stay in it. And I thought that was kind of interesting how vehemently that members of the community were against desegregated practices in Evanston and were not afraid to voice those opinions in a very public forum, sometimes in newspapers, sometimes in handwritten letters that directly addressed to Edwin B. Jourdain Jr. But for 16 years, he fought this and tried to bring better improvement within a Black community. His hardest fight to date was still always circling around housing. He had to fight Northwest University campus, he had to fight veteran housing, he had to fight general housing conditions in the city of Evanston, of which the quality of life was deferred so other areas of Evanston could be developed, and the Fifth Ward being ignored. And time again, if you read the city minutes at the time, he's always bringing issue to, we need services in the Fifth Ward. The alleys need to be clean. The streets need to be clean. We have to look at our housing and overpopulation. We need to improve in all of these things. He had to keep fighting those activities. So with these practices, with the adoption of Jim Crow ideas, with the ordinances that the city of Evanston started passing, we're slowly pushing the Black community in one area and also eliminating any further growth as much as possible. But within that fifth ward, you had a growing community that was self-sufficient. There was a segregated hospital, a segregated YMCA. There was a Black business district. To date, right now, there are over 35 Black churches in the city of Evanston, and then dozens and dozens of civic and social clubs that surrounded and paid attention to the Black community. But what codified a permanent Black community in Evanston was the aspect of the redlining maps that were developed through the federal government. And this particular map shows the city of Evanston. And if you look at the map, and the term redlining came from the area that is colored in red, looks kind of pinkish on the screen, that are usually labeled the most undesirable areas. And the element due to that was always citing because of a Negro population. If the Negro population was not there, then the area would be upgraded to a much better living condition. So you kind of see that, if you read this, the dialogue that went with this, of how they kind of illustrated that. And these maps inform banks, inform city government, and inform real estate agents of how to mitigate or utilize the map to further segregation in Evanston. Banks would refuse to make loans to Blacks in the Fifth Ward. Real estate agents would only steer Blacks who live in that area, in the D2 area, and steer them away from other areas of Evanston. The city government would take resources out of those areas and put them elsewhere. So when you have that happening at a consistent level, you start creating this disparity, which then looks like visually that here is a Black community that is not taking care of its property. It's not taking care of its community. But when you strip out all the resources and the banks are not investing in there, development's not investing in there, you depreciate an area, which then leaves a stigma behind within the community. And that carries over for generations and generations. With the codification of that, real estate agencies started having putting covenants in their housing deeds. And you can see down here near the bottom, restrictions that said premise shall not be conveyed, leased to, or occupied by anyone not a Caucasian, servants accepted. If they were due to allow that to happen, they could be in breach of contract, and the banks could take away the mortgage and the home. So it's a pressure on both sides, whites to make sure you enforce that, and Blacks to be barred from purchasing homes in areas of Evanston that were lined out of that. Shorefront had conducted in its early beginnings 25 years ago, a series of interviews of African-American community members. And I remember interviewing Michael Summers, who served at one point as a Fifth Ward alderman. He's a graduate. He born and raised in Evanston, graduate of ETHS, went on to Champaign-Urbana. He was a football star, married, met his wife and married, and brought her back to Evanston to live. And he proudly walked into a real estate agency during the 60s to seek housing for himself and his wife. And after sitting there for an inordinate amount of time, a real estate agent eventually came up and said, how can I help you? And he proudly said that, me and my wife are looking for a home to purchase. And the real estate agent said, we don't service Negroes. So when you have that type of blockage that happens within institutions and then banks that compound that, in city government that will not, that are lax on the enforcement of integrated housing, you have these barriers that come into play that affect the Black community. And it does that with our educational system. Foster School became a de facto segregated school because of its location of the Black community. When it closed down in the 1970s and moved the newly formed King Lab School from that location here in Foster School, that area, to I'm going to get the right place, um, roughly around here, where the new King Lab School is. It closed down a neighborhood school, and the fifth ward was divided up into 5 different areas where children were bused out of that school. So all those youth resources were taken out. The PTA was disbanded and divided up amongst multiple school systems, decreasing their overall power and authority over their children's education. The voices are not heard. And I'm not talking about like 1960s. I'm talking about present time, where you have Black families going to many of these PTA meetings, feeling like their voices are not being heard, and sometimes being told by residents that this is not your community. You don't have a say. And this is a direct impact of community members. You have children going to these schools, and after school's let out, they get boarded bus and bused back to their communities. So the idea of integrating schools is only during the school hours, but after school, it's everybody going back to their designated areas in their community. And that's why there's always been a fight now for a fifth ward school to help bring back a community-based school instead of having a business wasteland of non-activity during the school year. There used to be a branch library there. There used to be a bustling business district there, and it surrounded the foster school at that time. And because of that too, and with all the other elements that I talked about earlier, it leaves a perception that lasts for generations. This map appeared in 2008 on a blog when a person put on a blog, I am thinking about moving to Evanston. Where's a good place to live? And a few days later, somebody posted this map and made this nice drawing on top of that, where to live and where not to live. That map directly overlays the Hope map, where redlining is, the fifth ward, and where the Black population was pushed to. So the perception of a bad neighborhood lives on for generations because of all the elements that were stripped out of those communities. And it still plays a part in how we engage. When we talk about equity, when we talk about diversity, we have to understand that for decades, we forced that situation, and it's very hard to undo that. And going back to education for a bit, when foster school, I use foster school a lot for a model of how fast a community segregated itself. When foster school opened in 1905, it had a predominantly white student body and an all-white teaching staff. By 1930, it was an 85% Black pop student body. Still no Black teachers, because Black teachers were barred from teaching in Evanston until 1942. And the first Black teachers that were able to teach in Evanston taught at foster school. So with the growth of the Black community in that area, foster school became a de facto segregated school, and pushing other Black students from surrounding schools as much as possible into foster school. And sometimes that meant redrawing the school district maps to make sure enough Black families were going into foster school and not to the surrounding schools. So with our report that Jenny Thompson and I put together, and I just want to make clear that we did not like custom write something from scratch. We pulled from other studies and other works that have already been written. And we want to put it into one area, because when we started working with Reparations initiative here in Evanston, I started getting a lot of phone calls and emails about, well, what happened here in Evanston? And instead of answering each of these individual requests, I thought it would be a better idea to put together one comprehensive report that could bring all the different resources together in one place and have some summaries in there and have some extras from these reports so you can see and read for yourself that these policies did exist. We're still updating this document. It's about 75 pages now, but we're updating it more with some more information that we've come across. I'm in the middle of digitizing city ordinances and council minutes that the city of Evanston lent us, the microfilm reels. So we're getting them digitized and made into searchable PDFs. And eventually all this will be made public so that the public can investigate on their own. But we're finding some interesting things, and we're finding coded language in there. So you're not going to see something that directly says targeting the African-American community to discriminate against. You'll see things like this one page here on the Land Clearance Commission. And these addresses they have here are targeting Black communities to improvement by pushing the Black community out and bringing new development in. And I have to say, as a anecdotal story here, if this wasn't done, chances are there was a good chance that we could have had Michelle Obama growing up in Evanston, because her grandmother lived in Evanston at the time during this land clearance ordinance came into play and moved them back out into Chicago. So we missed out on something big. It makes me think about what else did we miss out on because of the practices that we have done in the city of Evanston. Who have we pushed out of Evanston? Who do we not include in Evanston? Whose voices are not being heard in Evanston? So hopefully this report will help with that, help with the policies and procedures that the city of Evanston is dealing with now, and how community members can engage and make city of Evanston truly what Evanston is trying to do is make this the most livable city in the United States. And because of the work that committed members of the community are doing, several resolutions have been passed to help address this. And this has taken some years to do. But I want to acknowledge a few of them here. With the first resolution introduced by Second Ward Alderman Ben Lionel John Baptiste in 2002, Resolution 43R02, which you can find online at the City of Evanston, for the City of Evanston's support of HR 40. It's the study of reparations and reparations work with Congress. And the whole meeting, city council meeting, set aside time for scholars and residents to voice their support and some historic background behind that. And that served as a guiding post for later in automatic servitude with Alderman Robin Rue Simmons, and who you'll hear from next week, who started working on reparations and bringing to light what Lionel John Baptiste was trying to do at that time, but actually put some teeth to it. With the help of Alderman Rainey's suggestion to use cannabis tax money to fund a reparations initiative in Evanston, really push forward some real work, really important work that has a potential to be transformative in Evanston. And with what I shared with today, what I shared with city government, aldermen, and other policymakers in the city of Evanston, our report proved very valuable for their work toward reparations. And understanding our past, this history of how all these ordinances, attitudes, policies, social constructs have all played a part in forming these issues that we are dealing with to this day. And with that, I thank you very much for this presentation.
Great. So Dino, thank you so much. It's so much good information. I am going to ask now that Lynn Kendall join us, and she's been kind of watching the chat. She's going to be sharing questions that have come up for you as you were presenting. So Lynn, take it away.
We have a number of questions. Here's one. Do you know how many houses owned by Black residents were physically moved from outside the Fifth Ward to within its boundaries?
I'm sorry, I wish I knew how many were done. And that's actually a complicated story. I've been asked about this before, if moving houses was racially motivated. And it's a mix. There have been instances where, yes, homes were, homeowners in predominantly white areas were told to either you move your house or we will raise that house. And you'll lose your property. So there are some Black families that actually physically move their houses to another location into the Fifth Ward. A lot of the house moving stopped when the elevator tracks came into play. But sometimes, I also have to put this out there, that house moving was something that's also popular and a money saver. So let's say if I had a property and I wanted to build a whole new house in place of the old house that's there. Now, instead of paying a contractor to tear down the old house, which will cost some money, I can sell that house to somebody else and have them move that house to their property, and then use that proceeds to help build a new house on my current property. So those are two things that I saw happening, but it's kind of hard to tell which would be racially motivated and what was done for economic purposes. But there are stories in there, like the story of our College Sutton. Boward Place, which is a street that no longer exists in Evanston, was a small Black community growing in Northwest Evanston. And that was one area where the city police came and said, you have 1 week to relocate your house or move because we are raising this area for new developments. And they had no say in that. There was no way they could fight that.
All right. Here's another. How did redlining affect the equity or wealth of the Black community? Is there a figure to estimate the loss of wealth due to redlining?
I think Robin Simmons would be a better person to ask that question. She's been following that. However, I can give you a personal story, and this happened to me recently. I live in the 5th Ward. I own a 2-flat, and I just finished refinancing my building. It was the 3rd try that was successful. The first try, the loan officer eventually said, no, we can't help you. The second try, we went through the process up through appraisal. The appraisal on my building in 2017, I'm gonna just like throw out a generic number. It's not a real number, but I will tell you to show you the difference here. Let's say it was $200,000. The appraisal came and appraised it at $100,000. Loss of equity right there from a 4-year gap from my last appraisal, I lost $100,000 worth of my property. So the loan never went through because it was too low. I waited a month and went through another agency, got through to the loan, through the appraisal of my property, and my property was appraised $75,000 above $200,000. So that was a gap between $175,000 of potential lost equity that affects my financial gain. It affects my credit. It affects my ability to refinance. It affected my ability to refinance the first time, but this last one was successful. But that's how, and talking with real estate agencies and banks, when you're refinancing, they're asked for 2 items of your pay stubs, 2 years of tax return, 2 of everything, but they only ask for 1 appraisal. And appraising is very subjective. And you're playing with human biases. And what I saw in the first appraisal that was appraised less, when I read through everything in there, I found the properties that he was selecting, and he purposely found places that were lower value and compared to that, and not truly compatible to what our building was. The second appraiser found buildings that were more like ours and understood the market, understood the potential, and appraised it higher. So you don't know where it's going to come from, but because it's so subjective and the banks lean on that so heavily, that can determine the net value of yourself and the value of your home, and can be grossly affected tremendously.
All right, here's another. Did any white people stand with and support Black people's resistance to Jim Crow policies in Evanston during the times you're discussing? If so, what happened with these alliances? And if not, why not?
I think there was a mix, and I'm basing this only on my readings and based on oral histories that I've conducted. So there were residents that had shared stories of fighting discriminatory practices and sharing with them their allies with that as well. So it ran across the board. There was a lot of helpful people, entities, organizations, churches that helped. What's hard to determine is how effective that help can be. It's very easy to change a policy, but it's very hard to change people's attitudes. And what I've seen in some instances, what some families have shared with me, is that there is talk about change and then there's actual action. So people can say, yes, I'm willing to help, but deep down inside, we're only going to help very minimally, as long as it doesn't impact on the privileges that I already have. Now, if I feel my privileges will be taken away, I will stop. So that seemed to be a pattern that I've noticed, but that's not to discount the genuine help that people who stood on the front line of marches, picket lines, and housing discriminatory acts, providing resources to assist in fighting these bad policies and discriminatory practices. And those are valuable. They need to be consistent, but sometimes the fight is designed to tire people out. And I think what I really love about this generation that's coming up, especially with the Black Lives Matter, it's less of pomp and circumstances and more action. If you don't do action, then talk is cheap. So act, and then we can talk about reconciliation.
We still have a number of questions. Is there chance that the near lakefront property that people were forced finally to sell would be restored to those families?
That is a possibility. There are still, you know, we could trace all these property owners to this date. The Evanston History Center fortunately collected some good information. If you haven't seen it, there are the house files in the Evanston History Center. And they show every house in Evanston and who occupied those homes throughout the building's existence up to about 1960. So you can read the names, see where they live, and sometimes see the value of the home at that time. Now, would it be restored? It all depends on the situation. If it was taken away, maybe there's a possibility. Maybe there is a path. If they sold it because they want to sell it for a profit, that's a different story. What we're finding with this new initiative that the City of Evanston is doing is that we have families now researching their family history to see what role discriminatory practices had played in their decision-making. And that's what we're still discovering to this day.
Let's see. What percentage of Evanston's Black community lives in the Fifth Ward today?
So the demographic is constantly changing, and because of classifications, that is also changing the numbers. So recently, some reporting is that there was an exodus of about 2,500 Black residents in the Fifth Ward that had moved out. But what I'm concerned about is that in the census, there is a new category of multi-ethnic. And you have those who used to identify themselves as African-American, the one drop rule, that was the only option you have, now are able to check multi-ethnic. And we're finding that more families are doing that than picking either Black or white. So I'm really interested in do more study in numbers. I'm not sure if it's cut and dry, as you know, the 2,500 members are decreasing, but it's a reclassification of identity that is informing that. But overall, the Fifth Ward is becoming more of a diverse community with still a heavier population of African-American presence, more of a 60-40 roughly, than what it used to be, let's say 50, 60 years ago, when it was more like 80-10 or 80-20 or 90-10%.
Let's see. Were Black citizens granted full access to the public library?
Yes and no. I'm working with this with just the interviews that I had conducted with families about accessibility in Evanston. And most residents, when I interviewed them, especially when they were seniors, they shared with us that it was, this is the comment I heard most often, it was customary that Blacks do not go downtown Evanston. If we were to go downtown Evanston, we would walk into a store, get specifically what we need, and leave. We were not welcome in groups, and we had to be careful what we've done. And so we relied on our own Black business district to handle our needs. The library use, of course, was in the schools, in the high school. The public library had some visitation, but there wasn't really like a specific focus I did on Evanston Public Library.
All right. Why was the history of the Fifth Ward never taught in our schools?
It wasn't taught in schools because information about the Fifth Ward, there was a non-interest. Let me kind of give you this story here. I think this will help lay it out about a perception. So, and if you're members of the Evanston History Center, this is just a fact of life. This is how things run sometimes. There was a director that was there that specifically stated to me when I was a board member there that there's nothing intrinsically valuable or interesting of the Black community. Therefore, no attention has been made to it. Schools need information, and teachers are inundated with how to find this information. And it's very hard to dig into something that's not readily available. And I realized that early on when I started doing Shorefront. And so my goal was to create resources so that teachers can utilize that information to teach in class. We're finding more teachers starting to use that material that Shorefront has provided to teach aspects in their class. Right now, Shorefront is trying to put together a curriculum for multiple grade levels, 2 in elementary, 1 in middle school, and 1 in high school. Some curriculum that teachers can utilize to teach history of the Black community in Evanston and up and down the North Shore. So there has to be a will, there has to be a mission for the school system to want to do that and make it a priority to mandate it across the board. And I think there's still that possibility to do that.
Continuing, what do you think about the proposal for a Fifth Ward TIF? Many times these projects end up pushing current residents out.
That is, so there has been a TIF in the Fifth Ward before, actually bordering the Fifth and Second Ward, primarily centering around Church and Dodge area intersection. That TIF failed. There are aspects where, and pardon me. Okay, it's not coming. I was about to sneeze, sorry. Where there was not enough for-profit businesses in that area to fund the TIF. And after a while, it had a negative balance of something like $12,000. So this new TIF, and there's can be mixed results in that if it's not handled properly. The fear is the unknown. The fear is, where will those monies be directed to? How will it improve the areas? And how can it be a better balance for the community members that have been living there for generations and are not forced out of their homes? Now, unfortunately, with real estate development, if you buy a house in the Fifth Ward and make improvements to it, the property value, the value of your home goes up, but also affects the property value of the home surrounding that. So if you're a family working on a fixed income, you can get taxed out of your own neighborhood and get redeveloped out of your own neighborhood. And it makes it less affordable to purchase in that neighborhood. And right now, the Fifth Ward is ripe for that. So there is a fear with that. And if there are other initiatives that can help balance that out to help retain families that are living in that area, not to be impacted negatively, then I think there's a hope for it. But it's a wait and see, and it's a trust issue with the city of Evanston, with residents. And I think that's what City Council is fighting with now, transparency and making sure the messaging is out there.
So, Dino, we have many more questions for you, as we knew we would, but we are out of time for this segment. So we are going to have to move ahead. We will definitely be sharing our questions, and maybe there'll be a way for us to be able to provide answers to the folks here. We do have emails, and if people would like us to send the information on to answer some of these questions, we will certainly do it. So thank you again.
And while this presentation is going, I'm looking at some of the questions. I'll try and answer some of them too while the rest of this is going to each of these, and it'll be addressed to everyone as well. So I'll try and do that.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your work at Shorefront, for your participation in the work around reparations in Evanston and for our community, and for being here today to help educate us further about Evanston's history. And it's just really been wonderful to have you here. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
So the next segment, we're going to explore the Evanston faith community's response to racial justice in the past and some ideas from panel members on how communities of faith can move forward. To lead this segment, I am going to be welcoming Reverend Eileen Wiviat, Senior Minister at the Unitarian Church of Evanston, or UCE. Reverend Eileen discovered Unitarian Universalism at UCE in 2001. She later served as UCE's membership director and social justice coordinator. And through this work, she felt called into ordained ministry. Eileen graduated from Meadville Lombard Theological School in May of 2017. And she was ordained and installed as UCE's assistant minister in June of that year. In January 2021, the congregation called her as their senior pastor. Her ministry is one of cultivating beloved community and working with love and justice toward collective liberation. She's grateful to serve in a community such as Evanston with such a strong commitment to equity, interfaith dialogue, and cooperation. Reverend Wiviat will introduce the panel members who will participate with her in this conversation. Welcome.
Thank you, Jackie. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Dino, for your presentation. So much information. There were tons of questions in there that I wish we had more time to hear more from you, but we have some really thoughtful presenters on our panel as well that we want to hear from. So thank you so much. I'm grateful, as Jackie said, to serve in this community, which is grappling with reparations in such an inclusive and accountable way, and which brings the voices of the faith community, which is strong and powerful in Evanston, into that conversation. Reparations and repair are most definitely theological issues, and it's a deeply relevant conversation for every faith community. Systemic white supremacy and racism in all its forms breach those covenants that all faiths share. That golden rule of equity and justice and compassion, and of loving our neighbor as ourselves. Yet our religious institutions have not only failed to repair the evils of racism, they have often played a central role in perpetuating the harm, or have at the very least remained silent and complicit. So we're going to explore a little bit what our role is and our responsibilities are as faith leaders and communities to advance reparations and create a more equitable and liberated future for Evanston. So I've been honored I'm honored to be asked to facilitate this conversation. I'm going to introduce our, oh, sorry, my dog. He's locked out of my room, but his shrill bark makes it in. I'm going to introduce our panelists. Reverend Deborah Y. Scott is a native of Gary, Indiana. She's a graduate from Purdue University with a Bachelor of Science degree. Also from Indiana University with a Master's of Public Administration and Human Service Administration, and from Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary with a Master's of Divinity. She received her final ordination as an itinerant elder in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, September 2002, and served 3 congregations in Indiana before being appointed at Ebenezer AME Church here in Evanston in 2016. Reverend Deborah has been bivocational throughout many of her years in pastoral ministry, and was employed by the state of Indiana for 23 years as a public assistance caseworker and supervisor. She currently serves on the 4th District AME Camp Baber Board of Trustees, and is the first-year studies instructor for the Board of Examiners in the Chicago Conference. Welcome, Pastor Deborah Scott. Rabbi Andrea London is a nationally recognized leader who has served Beth Emmet, the Free Synagogue here in Evanston, since 2000, and as the congregation's senior rabbi since July of 2010. Rabbi London serves as a vice president of the Chicago Board of Rabbis and co-chair of the J Street Rabbinic and Cantoral Cabinet. For many years, she served as the co-chair of the Jewish Council on Urban Affairs Jewish Muslim Community Building Initiative in the Chicago area, and she's also a graduate of the 2nd rabbinic cohort of the Jewish Mindfulness Meditation Teacher Training Program. In 2014, Rabbi London was named by the Forward newspaper as one of America's most inspiring rabbis for her work on racial equity, and she received the Religious Community Service Award from the Evanston North Shore branch of the NAACP in 2020. Welcome, Rabbi London. And Reverend Michael Wolf is an ordained minister in the American Baptist Churches USA as the senior minister at Lake Street Church. He was born and raised in Alabama and graduated summa cum laude from the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, with a BA in religious studies. He received his Master's of Divinity degree from Harvard in 2014, is now completing his PhD dissertation there.
I'll just add it's actually done now.
Oh, it is done. Congratulations. That's amazing. I know you
don't want to derail us, but I'm excited.
No,
so I did it.
that's very important to say that you are complete. That's excellent. Reverend Michael places issues of justice and peace at the center of his ministry. He conducts research on church sanctuary movements and campaigns for the living wage. He has worked with food pantries, cooperated with community leaders to combat the heroin epidemic in Massachusetts, and protested recent U.S. immigration policies. He lives here in Evanston with his wife, Anna Piela, and daughter, Zofia. Welcome, Reverend Michael. So given that all faith traditions are called to address poverty and suffering and injustice and a belief in the common humanity of all persons, how is it that faith communities have historically remained so silent and complicit in the face of so much injustice? Even here in our beloved Evanston, which is the town of 100 faith communities, or however many faith communities. Dino made a powerful case for the legal aspects of reparations, but what is our moral and ethical duty to be involved in reparations? Those are a lot of questions, but I'm going to start with Andrea, if you can answer that, and then we'll hear from Pastor Deborah and Michael.
Well, I think part of the case, certainly for the Jewish community, is about our history as well as our textual references. Our history both here in Evanston and our history as a people, that the foundational story for the Jewish people is that we were slaves and then we were freed. And when we went free with reparations. And that's our foundational story and how we understand ourselves and how we became a people. And we celebrate this every year on Passover, but this story is also told in our prayer service. Every day we have aspects of reminding ourselves of our past, and that our tradition teaches us that we know the heart of those who suffer because of the suffering that we went through, and we can't allow that to happen, and we need to work towards justice and equity. Additionally, just in Evanston, there, as Dina was talking about the housing, covenants that forced the Black community into one area, there were informal practices in which the Jewish community was also forced not to live in certain areas. Northwest Evanston was off limits to the Jewish community, and Beth Emmet being the first Jewish congregation in the area, we were formed in 1950, and where we are across the street from you, Eileen, on the corner of Dempster and Ridge, was the furthest north they would let a Jewish congregation go. They didn't want Jews any further north than that. And it was a fight to get a synagogue in an area that was very anti-Semitic. And the Jewish community all lived in South Evanston at that time because they couldn't buy anything further north. People wouldn't sell if you had a Jewish name. So we have that as well, and certainly the history of our congregation. You're talking about religious communities not being outspoken, and I think there's always much more that we can do, but I certainly feel very honored that I serve in a community that hosted Martin Luther King to speak at our congregation in 1958. This was, certainly shortly on the heels of the success of the Montgomery bus boycott, and as Martin Luther King's star was beginning to rise, but there were many other communities in Evanston and other places that would not have Martin Luther King come and speak. And as a matter of fact, he and his entourage came to the congregation, and they could not find a place to sleep. And where we now have our sanctuary side of the building was used to be a house there, and he and his entourage actually slept in the house there because there was no other place that would put them up in Evanston. And we are very fortunate that we have that 45-minute speech that he gave to the congregation that day, really pushing on all the points we've heard before about creating the beloved community. So we do have a history, in our congregation. But as I think the reparations movement is pushing all of us, we have to look really deeply into say, we may have talked a good game, we may have done some things that are right, but there's so much more, and the inequities in our country are legion. And I'm very pleased that Evanston is really trying to push very hard on this issue, that we've worked on it in terms of education, District 202, District 65, and we have much more to do.
Thank you, Rabbi London. Pastor Scott, do you have any thoughts about the role that Ebenezer AME has played in making folks aware of or resisting the complicity of faith communities in the injustices that have been done in the past and in the present?
Yes, hello, everybody. I think that Ebenezer does have a long history of being involved in the community. Being the first African American church in Evanston, that right there was breakthrough. But so much of the efforts of many churches in the African community have been just about surviving. They have been involved in helping with housing. Ebenezer, as you know, took the lead along with members other faith communities as well. But they really took the lead on the housing discrimination issue. And through the fighting that took place at City Hall and with Northwestern University, we have the two senior buildings that still exist today. They were instrumental when it came to the why. Blacks weren't allowed, so they had to create their own. So Ebenezer led the fight for that. For the hospital, Evanston Hospital didn't allow Black clients, nor did they hire Black professionals. And so Ebenezer helped to establish a hospital for the Blacks. So they've been involved, but as I said, it's been about surviving. I think one of the things, though, that is their strength, they have been able to work with other community faiths, which should be a model. If you really care about people, you really want the best for people, that we can work together as people, just human people. We all have a need for human dignity, human respect. I mean, those should all be universal goals that we are all striving for, regardless of our faith traditions. And often some of the projects and events that they've been involved in, they crossed those traditions. Just before the pandemic hit, Ebenezer was involved with a workshop about Black wealth with Alderman Rue Simmons. And so it was more or less focusing again on housing in the Fifth Ward. Many of the current generation, they're losing the house that their parents had because they can't afford the taxes. So that's the Black wealth that's eroding in our community. And so that seminar, that was about trying to qualify, find out what different ways and different things you can do to get your credit together, how you need to apply, what you need to apply for a loan, those kinds of things. So we're still involved. Can we do more? Yes. Should we do more? Yes.
Thank you, Pastor Scott. I think that what you said about many of the people in the Black community and Black churches are focusing on just surviving. And so what is the different responsibility and accountability of predominantly white congregations to learn and educate ourselves more thoroughly? I'm wondering, Pastor Wolf, if you might speak to the ways that our theology can sometimes, we can talk the talk, right? But how can our theology sometimes prevent us from breaking the complicity and keep us silent when we need to speak out and act, put our values into action? I don't know if you have thoughts about that.
I'm actually gonna, I guess I want to reach over to what Rabbi London was saying about the central story in the Jewish tradition being one of reparations, which is a supremely freedom from slavery and the following reparations. That's a supremely inspiring and great way to sort of think about that. I think in the Christian tradition, you have something like the kingdom of God that's definitely moving people to think about what it might be to imagine a world that has that doesn't have racism in it, that has the world governed as God would govern it, these sorts of ideas. But I think that one of the primary things that stands in Christian tradition's way anyway is this idea of atonement, that Christ has been the sacrifice for all. These ideas about grace that are present in the traditions can sometimes be a rather big roadblock for thinking about how we, just because grace perhaps enables a relationship with God doesn't mean that grace frees us from responsibility. So it's about having that double move. It's a very difficult double move to sort of talk with some Christians about. And, you know, when I talk about grace and responsibility being together, some people get pretty angry, but I think they're angry mainly because it's, you know, white folks having to really confront for the first time white supremacy and whiteness. But talking about that responsibility is a core part of the Christian tradition. Responsibility to our earth, responsibility towards owning our actions and working to do better. That's all part of the Christian tradition. But the incessant focus on grace as this sort of carte blanche to sort of do what we want, that's a real inhibitor. That is, you know, amongst Christians, that's a theological conversation. That amongst white Christians, that's a theological conversation that's harder to say, yeah, you got one half of the story and you know it really, really well. Have you considered the other half of the story, which is really important, which is your responsibility that your actions impact people? And so I think one of the things that is, I don't want to hog any conversation. It's just one of the most important things that I think about in my work and my pastoring is how do we make anti-racism a spiritual practice? How do we say that this is an important part of your faith? This is putting your faith into action when you take anti-racist action. And so building the scaffolding around that and having people think about that when they think about putting their faith into action, especially, you know, white churches. That's where I've spent my career. That's likely where I'm going to spend my career. So I talk to a lot of white people, right? But like, how do we make that a core part of how people think of their faith?
Yeah, thank you for that, making that point. I was thinking about when Dina was talking about answering the question about why isn't this taught in our schools? And I was wondering about what is our responsibility as faith communities to educate our congregations about our particular responsibility or role in complicity or active racism or silence or the impacts of racism in our community. So I'm curious about whether any of your congregations, how that manifests in your congregations. Do you have an active sort of education, understanding, looking through the archives, that kind of a process or personal reflection about anti-racism in your congregations, and what does that look like? Any of you feel free to chime in.
Yeah, we certainly have been doing a lot of anti-racism work at Beth Emmet over the course of many years, and like many things ebb and flow. But I would have to say over the last 10 years, there's really been a very concerted effort to be doing that education, both just within our own community, which is primarily a white community, but not exclusively so. And part of the work we're trying to do is also to understand the diversity of the Jewish community in terms of race, which is becoming more and more diverse. And so when we make assumptions about who we are, you know, to not make assumptions that all of us are white. And so we've been trying to do this work internally as well as, you know, talking about more in general in the in the community. Outside of the congregation. We've been doing this work also, you know, with the Black community. Beth Emmet in particular has had a very long-standing and deep relationship with the Second Baptist Church that predates my arrival to the community. But over the last 10 years, we have become much more integrally connected with each other. And I think that one of the most powerful things that we've done as a community, in addition to a lot of this educational work, is in 2013, we took our teens from our congregations, and not just from Second Baptist, but also teens from some of the other Black churches in town. And we went on what's known as a Sankofa trip. Sankofa is a word from West African language called Akan, and the symbol of it is a mother bird looking back at her tail feathers and seeing an egg that is being born, and that we need to look back into our future in order to birth our look back into our history in order to birth our future, which is a really powerful and important notion. And certainly we believe that very strongly Jewishly. In fact, we've just spent the last month in the Jewish community. We need to look back over the past year and to make amends for what we've done before we can move into the new year. We spent a whole month, thinking about that and reaching out to others and doing what we call tshuva, which is really reparations. It's a core part of how we celebrate our new year. Our holiest days of the year are about personal introspection and making amends. And that's what we've been engaged in. And so that's certainly a word that resonated really strongly with me. We don't have one word in the Hebrew for it, but that concept really exists, and that image of that mother bird is just so powerful. And we got it was about 40 people who went, and chaperones from both sides, and also our students. And one of the most powerful things we did is we paired all the students. This is part of the methodology. And so it's not just we went to go see civil rights sites, which were fantastic and amazing and provocative. We were in Atlanta, Selma, Montgomery, Birmingham, and Memphis, and seeing all the sites there and doing them together. But to have a partner that you sat on the bus with, had to room with, had to process everything that you saw with, somebody who is different than you are. And it just really opened for so many of our young people. And frankly, for me as a chaperone, I was like, well, I was the chaperone. And every day I was learning new things that were mind blowing. And there was a lot of tears throughout the week because it was just so much to take in. And but there was so much growth that happened as well. And I would say that I think that for me, that trip really had a profound impact on, I was listening to the lecture from last week and really talking about this idea of we look at things from our own perspective so easily, right? And when we have to walk in somebody else's shoes and to see something else from somebody else's perspective, we can no longer then claim that we understand things just from this one perspective, and that we have to open ourselves up. And this trip was very, very powerful in that. And, Dino said today, you can change policy, but it's hard to change attitudes. And I'll tell you, in that 6-day trip, I think that attitudes were like blown apart is what happened. And we need to continue to do that. And there've been other examples I can give, but this is where we really have to allow people to see other perspectives and to understand the importance of this work, and understand how racism didn't end when slavery ended. Racism didn't end during the civil rights era. This is what people who are in my community will say, well, it's over. Yeah, okay, so maybe slavery didn't end, but civil rights movement, it ended, right? And just the education, right? Everyone's like, no, the education that needs to be done to show how it continues to be in place. And when people are educated, and I've seen my community move, it's just, they can no longer, claim to say we can't do anything about it. We have to do something.
Thank you. Pastor Scott, are you you mentioned a little bit about those partnerships. I think you're right, Rabbi London, that relationship building is the key component to our transformation in so many ways. Can you talk a little bit more about the partnerships that you've formed in doing the work, especially about reparations?
I think that it is important to have those partnerships. We've been working with the city, like I said, Alderman Ruth Simmons, during this whole pandemic season. We had the sort of interfaith clergy. We came together. It's really important to share stories. In sharing your story, you get to understand who the person is, what they've been through, maybe understand some of their responses. And I think that has been helpful. As we are talking more about reparations, I think within the Black community, for us, this is really more a time of healing. Listening to Rabbi London, and she's talking about in their Jewish tradition, every time they get together, they rehearse their history. That has
Mhm.
not always been our tradition. We
Mm.
kept a lot of stuff in. Just in this Sunday and even last Sunday is watching some of the presentations, there was a lot of discomfort for me. I wasn't there as they're retelling the different stories, different things that happened, but it's almost as if it's in my DNA.
Sure.
And so I'm reliving the trauma.
Yeah.
And so right now, a lot of congregations are just talking about how can we heal, telling the stories about what they went through, what life has been like for them. Just a quick story, since I've been at Ebenezer maybe 3 years ago, Evanston Hospital wanted to commemorate their 100th anniversary. So I was contacted and they said they had a boulder that they wanted to place on the property of Ebenezer because that was the site of Evanston Hospital. Well, I couldn't find anything, no proof of that. At that time, I had 4 or 5 people in their 90s, early hundreds that were still alive, so they would have known the history. They did not. And so my question to them was, how can I reconcile with my community to put a boulder on our property and we couldn't even go into your hospital?
Yes. Yes.
So their response was, but we've already got the boulder. We already have the plaque. Like, really? But there was no conversation with us prior to. It was just, we got a boulder, we're ready to put it on your property. Be happy. But what they ended up doing was going across the street, which I believe is where the Y, the black Y, the Negro Y was housed, but they put their boulder across the street. So it was just the assumption, presumption.
Yeah.
Deal with it, take it, but not having any consideration of the history, the trauma that people went through. So it's that kind of thing that's still going on today. Yes, mind blown, right? How can you do that?
Right. Right.
Thank you for sharing that story. I mean, thank you for sharing something just like right now, super recent, and I don't know. It's just it's a great.
I think you froze up there a little bit, Michael. Yeah. Oh, you're
I'm
back.
just
Are you
saying it was
back?
a great for sharing. So
it's a great example of the way that it's still alive. It's still racism and white supremacy. That perspective is still so real and alive, and it's such a barrier to our relationship building. And so I think we just all have a lot of work to do to try to figure out how to listen better. Those of us with white skin privilege, to listen better and be more responsive to that trauma that has been experienced. So even up to right now. Do we have time for? I'm looking at the time. I don't know if we have time for questions, Jackie.
Yeah, so we do want to take some time for questions, even
Okay.
just to get a few of them out there. There are many, again. So I'm going to ask Lynn to kind of join us
Okay,
again.
great.
She's been watching and she will pose some of these questions.
Happily, there are 2 questions which really relate to the same thing, directed to Dr. Wolf. That First Baptist, now Lake Street Church, used to be a multiracial congregation years ago. How well does the present community know their history with Second Baptist, now a sister church? What, if any, role did racism in the community play the congregation and its separation into 2 faith communities?
right. So this is always, like everything, a little complicated, and I think not complicated like in we're just trying to say it wasn't racism. I think whenever you're dealing with a congregation that is multiracial, that splits into white and black, you're dealing with racism. But also in the black community, you're dealing with a real search and striving for self-determination and flourishing that was exciting thing in some ways for Second Baptist. And so we did change the name to Lake Street Church of Evanston. We used to be First Baptist. We have a sister church that's oriented. It was Second Baptist because of our history. That's where all the history sort of comes up a lot of times, is telling that story. And how we are covenanted now in the current moment to fighting racism and combating racism. That is the covenant that we have. It's about truth telling. I'll tell you that sometimes folks in my community, and that was started in the 90s, sometimes my folks in my community get stuck a little bit on the guilt and the separation type part of that. But I think that we want to tell that story, and we also really want to honor the combating racism part of the covenant and how we can do that and how we can be held to account. But I think it's that relationship to me is really important and we're going to be, this is Lake Street stuff, but we're going to be looking at how to do it more robustly. But it's important to have accountability in collaborations, especially when you're dealing with a mostly white church like mine. It's important to have accountability. And so that Second Baptist Church relationship is an accountability partner for us to live up to that covenant. So that's a little bit about that. I see some conversation about the Second Baptist Church and First Baptist Church and Lake Street Church of Evanston. But yeah, telling that story is alive and well in our community. And hopefully also the second part, the combating racism, is just as alive and just as well.
Do we have time for one more question, do you think? Let's try it. How can our religious communities in Evanston continue changing attitudes, blowing up old perspectives, so we can change our understanding and relationships with each other?
I think that's open to anybody to answer, yeah?
I mean, for me, when I'm thinking about that, part of blowing up perspectives is also trying to wrestle with how can communities like mine, especially, how can we practice reparations and practice that work of repair? And what does it look like to practice that repair? And so to me, it's also about accountability and doing the thing that we think is so great and that we're willing to talk about. And sometimes that costs something, and that's always hard.
I think it's important that we just continue to show up. I mean, that's one of the mainstays of the faith community. We show up. So we keep showing up for the fight, keep showing up for the conversations, keep showing up to open doors, to allow different groups to come in and meet at your house of worship. So just continue to show up.
I think that showing up is so important when you have religious traditions that are thousands of years old, to remind yourself also that change doesn't happen overnight and that you have to keep plugging away at it. You can't go to one rally or sign one petition. It's not about a one-off. This is about practice, and religious communities understand that each and every day you have to practice the faith by what you do. And so I 100% agree with Pastor Scott on that issue. And while it's very, very important to listen to stories and be open to hearing other perspectives, and to listen, not to interject your own opinion, but to really hear what someone else's perspective is. It's also not the responsibility of the Black community to have to educate the white community. So I'll sometimes find in my own community, okay, well, we need to learn about this. So is the Black community going to come and teach us about all of this? And I said, it's not their responsibility to teach us about this. And there are things that we're going to do in cooperation, and there's things that we need to do on our own in order to learn and to grow. And so we've really undertaken at Beth Emmet an effort to teach our community, and to look at ourselves and to understand what does white privilege mean? What's the history of this country? What are the ways in which history hasn't been taught accurately to us? What are the myths that we continue to live with? And how do we really see the reality of what our country has been? And it's been eye-opening. It's been sometimes painful. And people have had to put aside, their assumptions and the myths, with which they grew up, and to look seriously at who we are, and we have to continue that process.
Thank you so
Incredible.
much for saying that, Rabbi London, about not expecting Black folks and people in the Black community to educate those of us with white skin privilege to, because I mean, I hear that a lot in my community too, is that we very much want to have these relationships of accountability, but to form those authentically and from a place of humility and not seeking those relationships so that we can be absolved as white folks, but to really seek them genuinely, to be able to be in solidarity to work towards a more just and equitable world. It is a practice, and it is a lifelong practice, I think, to do that well.
If I can just add one point to that, which I often find in my community, it's that, well, and people in the Black community, they can come here as opposed to we need to go out and put ourselves into the community. And I think that
Right.
has been part of our privilege, is we just kind of think we can sit back and people come to us, and how important it is to show up and to be there in community and to be out in spaces in which, you know, you might be the only white person there, and to see and to be part of and to care, you know, deeply for others in the community. And I think that's just a really, really important practice when people say, you know, we want to be in these relationships. Well, then go.
Yeah.
You know, you have to make an effort.
Yeah.
Great. So I just cannot thank you all enough. We want to thank every one of you for your role as faith leaders in our community, your leadership, for participating in a really rich discussion and offering your insights and your wisdom. Everybody, I'm sure, on this session is looking for, you know, we're people of faith looking for learning more and hearing more. And these are just such helpful things and meaningful things for all of us. So thank you so much for your participation. So I just want to remind everybody that the final session of the Faith, Justice, and Reparations workshop is going to be next Sunday at 4. And next session is going to be focused on where we are today and what's next. So Robin Roos-Simmons will be with us to share the details and the differences between the two reparations programs that are in Evanston, and also the issues that are currently facing them. We'll spend a little time in conversation as well to think about ideas on how we support these local programs as well as national reparations, both with our financial resources and also in other ways. And then finally, we want to ask everyone, we will be asking everybody to kind of reflect on how you're called to act around this issue of racial justice and reparations, and what you as an individual can commit to do as a person of faith at this time. So there will be pre-work. We will send that out with the email that we'll be sending out this week, along with the recording of today. And now I'd like to invite back Reverend Wibia, the senior minister from UCE, to help to close today's session.
Thank you. Thank you again, Jackie and Sarah, and all of the leaders in the faith communities that have put this workshop together. I know it's been a tremendous amount of work, and it's been very meaningful to be a part of. I invite you all to join me in a spirit of prayer. Source of love, spirit of life, God of justice and mercy, we are grateful for this time together as people of many, many faiths. We, with all of us having faith in the power of love and the power of community to transform, to create justice and bring peace. We ask that you move through us and with us as we struggle to transform our hearts and minds and strive to become better stewards of the land and better companions to all those who live on the land. May it be so. May we make it so. Amen.
Amen. Thanks, everybody, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you. Thanks, Holly.